Jack Tanner had seen a lot in his 32 years, war-torn planets, collapsing stars, and more close calls than he could count. But nothing prepared him for the sight of the Crimson Dominion's slave market. His small ship, the Sky Runner, hummed quietly as he drifted through the asteroid belt of Gamma 7, a forgotten corner of the galaxy where scavengers like him hunted for scraps of old tech. The market wasn't on any map, but the rumors had led him here, a floating fortress of red metal, glowing faintly against the black void of space. He adjusted the controls, his rough hands steady despite the flicker of nerves in his chest. Jack wasn't a hero. He was a survivor, ex-military, turned scavenger after the Earth Coalition fell apart. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his jacket patched from years of wear, but his sharp green eyes missed nothing. Through the viewport, he saw ships docking at the fortress, their hulls marked with the Dominion's claw-like symbol. Rich buyers, warlords, and worse, all here for one thing, power. Jack's plan was simple. Sneak in, grab some rare tech, and get out before anyone noticed. He'd faked credentials before, posing as a minor trader wasn't hard. He pulled on a long coat, hiding the plasma cutter and scanner tucked into his belt, and stepped onto the docking bay. The air smelled of ozone and metal, thick with the hum of machinery. Guards in crimson armor patrolled, their reptilian faces hidden behind visors, but they barely glanced at him. To them, he was just another greedy fool. The market was a maze of cages and platforms, lit by harsh red lights. Alien voices chattered in languages Jack didn't understand, bartering over living beings like they were spare parts. He kept his head down, scanning for anything valuable, when he saw her. She stood on a raised platform, surrounded by a crowd of bidders. Her skin was a deep blue, shimmering like the surface of a still ocean, and her silver hair flowed down her back. Chains glowed faintly around her wrists, pulsing with energy. But it was her eyes, bright yellow, fierce, and unbroken, that stopped Jack in his tracks. "This is Lila," the auctioneer barked, a squat creature with too many arms. "Bound by the Dominions will for 400 years. Master of energy fields, destroyer of fleets. Starting bid, 10 million units." The crowd erupted, credits flying as bidders shouted. Jack edged closer, his scanner buzzing faintly in his pocket. The chains weren't ordinary, they were tech, old and powerful, controlling her every move. He'd seen similar devices in the war, used to break soldiers' minds. But Lila didn't look broken. She stood tall, her gaze cutting through the chaos like a blade. Jack didn't know why he stayed. He should have walked away, found his tech, and left. But something about her, maybe the defiance in her eyes, maybe the way she reminded him of the friends he'd lost, kept him rooted. The bids climbed higher, reaching 50 million, when a hulking figure in crimson robes stepped forward. 70 million, it growled, its voice like grinding stone. The crowd fell silent. Jack's scanner identified the buyer, a Dominion enforcer, one of Lord Varn's inner circle. The auctioneer grinned. "Sold. To Commander Core." Guards moved to unchain Lila, but Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen, not because he was noble, but because he knew what the Dominion did with weapons like her. He'd seen planets burn, people he cared about turn to ash. Before he could stop himself, he raised his hand. 80 million, he shouted. The crowd turned, murmuring. The auctioneer blinked, confused. "Name yourself, bidder." "Trader Vance," Jack lied, his voice steady. "Funds verified." He held up a forged credit chip, praying it'd hold up long enough. Core's eyes narrowed, but the auctioneer hesitated. Greed won out. 80 million, going once. Core roared, "He's a fraud. Seize him." Guards lunged, but Jack was already moving. He tossed a smoke grenade from his belt, stolen from his military days, and the platform erupted in gray haze. Shouts filled the air as he sprinted toward Lila. She watched him, unmoving, as he reached her chains. The plasma cutter hummed to life, slicing through the metal, but not the glowing cuffs. "What are you doing, human?" Her voice was low, sharp, cutting through the chaos. Jack didn't answer, grabbing her arm. "Run," he snapped, pulling her into the smoke. She didn't resist, her steps light and swift despite centuries of captivity. They dodged through the market, guards firing energy bolts that scorched the walls. Jack's heart pounded, but his old combat instincts kicked in. He led her down a narrow corridor, toward the docking bay. "Why help me?" Lila asked, her tone curious, not grateful. "Later." Jack grunted, shoving open a hatch. The Sky Runner waited, engines warm. They piled inside, and he slammed the controls, the ship lurching free of the fortress. Alarms blared as Dominion fighters swarmed after them, red streaks against the stars. Jack gripped the yoke, weaving through the asteroid belt. "Hold on," he yelled. Lila braced herself, her cuffs still glowing. Through the chaos, she studied him, a faint smirk on her lips. "You're either brave or stupid," she said. "Bit of both," Jack muttered, dodging a missile. The fighters closed in, and he knew they couldn't outrun them, not yet. But as the Sky Runner shook under fire, Lila raised her hands. The cuff sparked, and suddenly, the enemy ships jerked, spinning wildly as if caught in a storm. Jack stared. "What was that?" "Energy fields," she said simply. "I bend them. The Dominion made me their weapon." Her smirk faded. "You freed me from the market, human. But these cuffs, they still bind me to their will." Jack swore under his breath. The fighters regrouped, and the fortress loomed behind them, a red giant ready to swallow them whole. He punched the throttle, the ship groaning as it sped deeper into the asteroids. "We'll figure it out," he said, more to himself than her. "I'm not done yet." Lila's yellow eyes glinted. "Neither am I." The Sky Runner streaked through the asteroid belt, engines whining as Jack pushed the old ship to its limits. Dominion fighters trailed behind, their red hulls glinting like predators in the dark. Inside the cockpit, Jack's hands flew over the controls, his jaw tight with focus. Beside him, Lila sat still, her blue skin catching the faint glow of the dashboard. The cuffs on her wrists pulsed with a dull orange light, a reminder that freedom was still out of reach. "They're gaining," Jack said, glancing at the rear scanner. 3 fighters, fast and armed to the teeth, fired energy bolts that grazed the ship's hull. The Sky Runner shuddered, warning lights flashing red across the console. Lila tilted her head, her yellow eyes narrowing. "Let me handle it." Before Jack could respond, she raised her hands. The cuff sparked, and a ripple spread through the air. Outside, the fighters wobbled, then spun out of control, crashing into asteroids with fiery bursts. Jack stared, his grip loosening on the yoke for a moment. "You're full of surprises," he muttered, steering them deeper into the belt. "How'd you do that?" "Energy fields," Lila said, her voice calm but edged with something sharp. "I can twist them, move things, break things. The Dominion taught me to destroy. It's all they ever wanted." Jack didn't reply right away. He'd seen weapons like her before, soldiers turned into tools, stripped of choice. It made his stomach twist, but he shoved the thought aside. They weren't safe yet. The scanner beeped again, showing a larger ship, a Dominion frigate, emerging from behind a massive asteroid. Its cannons glowed, ready to fire. "We can't outrun that," Jack said, his mind racing. He banked the Sky Runner hard, dodging a blast that lit up the void. "Got any more tricks?" Lila smirked, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Plenty. But these cuffs, they limit me. I can feel their hold, pulling me back to them." Jack glanced at the glowing restraints. "Then we need to get them off. Any ideas?" She hesitated, studying him. "There's a tracker inside. If we don't disable it, they'll find us no matter where we go." "Great," Jack groaned, swerving to avoid another barrage. The frigate was closing in, its shadow swallowing the stars. He scanned the cockpit, then grabbed a toolkit from under his seat. "Hold still. I'll take a look." Lila raised an eyebrow but extended her wrists. Jack worked fast, his fingers steady despite the chaos outside. He pried open a small panel on one cuff with a screwdriver, revealing a mess of wires and a tiny blinking light. "There's the tracker," he said. "Old tech, but tricky. I can fry it, but it might mess with whatever's controlling you." "Do it," Lila said without hesitation. "I'd rather risk that than go back." Jack nodded, pulling out a handheld disruptor, a scavenger's tool for shorting out circuits. He aimed it at the tracker and fired a quick pulse. The cuff sparked wildly, the orange glow flaring brighter, then dimming to a faint shimmer. Lila gasped, her hands trembling for a moment before she steadied herself. "Did it work?" Jack asked, eyes flicking between her and the controls. She flexed her fingers, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The tracker's dead. And, something's different. I feel stronger." Before Jack could ask what she meant, the frigate fired again. This time, Lila reacted faster. She thrust her hands forward, and the space around the Sky Runner warped. The energy bolts veered off, bending like light through a prism, and slammed into a nearby asteroid instead. The rock shattered, sending debris spinning. Jack let out a low whistle. "That's new. The cuffs aren't holding me back as much," Lila said, her voice tinged with wonder. "I can push further now." "Good," Jack replied, "because we're not out of this yet." He punched the throttle, aiming for a narrow gap between two asteroids. The frigate followed, its bulk scraping the rocks as it tried to keep up. Jack's mind churned, piecing together a plan. He'd flown through worse in the war, dodging drones, outsmarting fleets. If Lila's power was growing, maybe they could turn the tables. "Think you can mess with their engines?" he asked, keeping his tone casual despite the stakes. Lila's smile widened, sharp and dangerous. "Watch me." She closed her eyes, focusing, and the air in the cockpit hummed with energy. Outside, the frigate's engines flickered, then stalled. The massive ship drifted, helpless, as Jack pulled the Sky Runner out of range. "Nice work," he said, grinning despite himself. "We might actually survive this." "Don't get cocky," Lila shot back, though there was a spark of amusement in her eyes. "They'll send more." She was right. The scanner pinged again, two smaller ships, scouts, peeling off from the frigate to chase them. Jack cursed under his breath. The Sky Runner was tough, but it wasn't built for long fights. Its shields were failing, and the hull groaned with every hit. He needed a new move, something crazy enough to work. "There," he said, pointing to a distant planet on the NAV screen, a gray, lifeless rock with jagged peaks. "We'll lose them there. Can you keep us alive long enough to land?" Lila nodded. "I'll try." She raised her hands again, and the scouts faltered, their shots going wide. Jack pushed the ship harder, the engines screaming as they broke free of the asteroid belt. The planet loomed closer, its surface a blur of dust and stone. The scouts stayed on their tail, relentless. "Hold on!" Jack shouted, diving toward the surface. The Sky Runner shook violently, heat building as they hit the atmosphere. Lila braced herself, her power flaring to deflect a final barrage. The scouts followed, but Jack had one last trick. He jerked the yoke, pulling the ship into a tight spin, and aimed for a canyon barely wide enough to fit. The scouts couldn't react in time, one smashed into the canyon wall, the other veered off, damaged. The Sky Runner skidded across the rocky ground, metal screeching as it came to a stop. Dust clouded the viewport, and silence fell. Jack let out a shaky breath, slumping in his seat. We made it. Lila unbuckled herself, standing with a grace that didn't match the crash. For now. But they'll keep coming. Jack climbed out of the pilot's chair, wincing as he stretched. The cockpit was a mess, sparks flew from a busted panel, and the air smelled of burnt wiring. He grabbed his toolkit again, turning to Lila. Those cuffs. We need to figure out what's left of them. If they're still tied to the Dominion, we're not safe. She held out her wrists, the cuffs now faintly glowing with a strange, shifting light, not orange, but something softer, almost silver. Jack scanned them, frowning. The disruptor didn't just kill the tracker. It rewired something. The energies, unstable. Unstable how? Lila asked, her tone sharp. Dunno yet, Jack admitted. Could mean they can't control you anymore, or it could mean they'll find us faster. Either way, we're stuck here until I fix the ship. Lila stepped closer, her yellow eyes locked on his. You're not like them, the Dominion. They'd never risk themselves for someone like me. Why are you? Jack hesitated, the weight of her question sinking in. He thought of the war, the friends he'd lost to the Dominion's cruelty, the way power twisted everything it touched. I've seen what they do, he said finally. Turning people into weapons, breaking them. I couldn't just walk away. She studied him, then nodded slowly. You're a fool, Jack. But a brave one. He smirked, brushing off the compliment. Yeah, well, brave's gotten me this far. Let's see if it keeps us alive. Outside, the wind howled across the desolate planet, kicking up clouds of gray dust. The Sky Runner sat battered but intact, a small speck against the endless stone. Jack started pulling tools from the wreckage, his mind already working on repairs. Lila watched, her cuffs glowing faintly, a mystery neither of them could solve yet. But as they worked, a shadow passed overhead, a Dominion scout, circling high above. Lila's hands clenched, energy crackling around her fingers. Jack grabbed a wrench, his heart sinking. They'd bought time, but not much. The fight was far from over. The desolate planet stretched out in every direction, a wasteland of cracked stone and swirling dust. The Sky Runner sat half buried in the gray dirt, its hull dented from the crash. Jack knelt beside it, tools scattered around him as he patched a gaping hole in the engine bay. Sweat streaked his face, mixing with grime, but his hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who'd fixed worse under fire. Above, the Dominion scout circled like a vulture, its engines a low hum against the wind. Lila stood nearby, her blue skin stark against the dull landscape. Her silver hair whipped in a breeze, and the cuffs on her wrists glowed with that strange, shifting light, silvery now, pulsing faintly. She watched the scout, her yellow eyes narrowing. They're scanning, she said. Looking for us. Jack grunted, tightening a bolt. Let them look. We're not going anywhere until this ship's ready. He glanced up, wiping his brow. Can you keep them off us? She smirked, a flicker of confidence breaking through her guarded expression. I can do more than that. She raised her hands, and the air around her buzzed. The scout wobbled, its engine stuttering as an invisible force tugged at it. With a flick of her wrist, Lila sent it spinning into a distant cliff. The crash echoed across the plain, a plume of smoke rising from the wreckage. Jack let out a low whistle. Remind me not to get on your bad side. You already have, Lila said dryly, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. She lowered her hands, the cuffs sparking briefly. The power's growing. Whatever you did to these chains, it's changing me. Jack stood, brushing dust off his patched jacket. Good or bad? Too soon to tell, she replied, holding up her wrists. But it's not their control anymore. It feels mine. He nodded, grabbing his scanner from the toolkit. Let's see what we're dealing with. He ran the device over the cuffs, its screen lighting up with jagged energy readings. The disruptor scrambled the old system, all right. The tracker's gone, but the power source, it's amplifying something. Maybe your abilities. Lila flexed her fingers, and a faint ripple spread through the dirt at her feet, lifting pebbles into the air. It's more than I could do before. The Dominion kept me weak, just enough to serve them. Now, she trailed off, her eyes glinting with possibility. Jack scratched his jaw, thinking. If we can figure it out, maybe we can use it. Turn their own weapon against them. He'd seen long shots work in the war, crazy plans that somehow paid off. This felt like one of those. Before Lila could answer, the ground trembled. A low rumble built, and Jack spun around, spotting a cloud of dust on the horizon. Company, he muttered, dropping the scanner and grabbing a plasma rifle from the ship's hatch. Lila stepped beside him, her hands already glowing with energy. 3 Dominion dropships burst through the dust, their red armor gleaming. They landed hard, kicking up grit, and disgorged a squad of soldiers, tall, reptilian figures in crimson plating, armed with energy lances. A larger figure emerged last, its armor studded with black spikes. Jack's scanner pinged, a Dominion captain, high rank. Stay where you are, the captain barked, its voice a guttural hiss. The slave belongs to Lord Varn. Surrender, or die. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle. Not big on negotiation, huh? He glanced at Lila. You ready? She nodded, her expression hardening. They'll regret finding us. The soldiers charged, lances blazing with blue fire. Jack dove behind a rock, returning fire with precise shots that cracked their armor. Lila moved like a storm, her hands weaving patterns in the air. The ground buckled under the soldiers, hurling them skyward, while their own lance blasts bent back, striking their comrades. The captain roared, lunging at her with a massive blade, but Lila twisted the air around it, snapping the weapon in half. Jack rolled out of cover, taking down 2 more soldiers with quick bursts. Nice teamwork, he shouted, grinning despite the chaos. Don't get used to it, Lila shot back, slamming a wave of energy into the captain. It staggered but didn't fall, its armor glowing as it absorbed the hit. The captain raised a clawed hand, and a beam of red light shot from a device on its wrist, striking Lila's cuffs. She gasped, dropping to one knee as the cuffs flared, their light shifting to a harsh crimson. They're trying to take me back, she hissed, clutching her wrists. The signal, it's stronger now. Jack cursed, firing at the captain to draw its attention. The shots bounced off its armor, but it turned toward him, giving Lila a moment to recover. Fight it, he yelled. You said it's yours now, prove it. Lila's eyes blazed, and she forced herself up, her hands trembling. The cuffs pulsed, red battling silver, until she screamed, a raw, defiant sound that shook the air. The energy exploded outward, shattering the captain's device and sending it crashing into a dropship. The remaining soldiers froze, then fled back to their ships, engines roaring as they lifted off. Jack lowered his rifle, breathing hard. You okay? Lila nodded, though her face was tight with effort. I broke their hold. For now. She held up her wrists, the cuffs glowed silver again, but faint cracks spiderwebbed across them. They're weakening. Good, Jack said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Because I've got a feeling that wasn't the last of them. He turned back to the Sky Runner, assessing the damage. The engine was patched, but the shields were shot. They could fly, barely. Lila followed his gaze. Where to now? Jack hesitated, then met her eyes. The captain mentioned Lord Varn. He's the head of the Dominion, right? She nodded, her expression darkening. He's the one who enslaved me. Used me to burn worlds, crush rebellions. He'll want me back, not just for power, but to send a message. Then we don't run, Jack said, his voice firm. We fight. Varn's got tech like those cuffs all over the galaxy, binding people like you. If we can stop him, we stop it all. Lila stared at him, surprise flickering across her face. You take on the Dominion? For me? Not just for you, Jack said, thinking of the war, the losses, the way humanity had clawed its way back from nothing. For everyone they've hurt. I'm done letting tyrants win. She studied him, then smiled, a real one, not sharp or mocking. You're mad, Jack. But I like it. He grinned back, adrenaline still pumping. Let's get this ship up. We've got work to do. They climbed aboard, Jack settling into the pilot's seat while Lila took the co-pilot's chair. The Sky Runner groaned as its engine sputtered to life, lifting off the cracked ground. The sky above was clear for now, but Jack knew more Dominion forces were coming. He plotted a course toward a nearby system. Rumors said Varn kept a stronghold there, a fortress of red steel and dark secrets. As they broke orbit, Lila spoke, her voice quieter. Varn's not just after me. He's planning something bigger. I heard whispers, centuries ago, about a weapon to control every star, every life. If he gets me back, he'll finish it. Jack's hands tightened on the controls. Then we make sure he doesn't. Whatever it takes. The Sky Runner soared into the void, a small spark against the endless dark. Behind them, the crashed scout burned out, a warning to the Dominion that their prey wasn't helpless. Ahead lay a fight Jack couldn't fully imagine, but he'd faced worse odds and come out swinging. Beside him, Lila's cuffs glowed, her power simmering, ready to break free. Together, they were a force the galaxy wasn't ready for. The Sky Runner cut through the void, its engines rumbling as Jack guided it toward the Dominion stronghold. The system ahead glowed faintly on the NAV screen, a cluster of asteroids orbiting a dying star, with Varn's fortress carved into the largest rock. Red lights pulsed across its surface, a fortress of steel and shadow that screamed power. Jack's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced. They were flying into the heart of the enemy with a half-repaired ship and a plan that was more hope than strategy. Lila sat beside him, her blue skin reflecting the cockpit's dim light. The cuffs on her wrists shimmered silver, cracked but still glowing with energy. She'd been quiet since they left the desolate planet, her yellow eyes fixed on the stars. Jack could feel the weight of her thoughts, centuries of servitude, now teetering on the edge of freedom. We're close, he said, breaking the silence. Scanners show heavy defenses, turrets, fighters, the works. Any ideas? Lila turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Smash through them. It's what I'd do. Jack chuckled despite the tension. Tempting, but the Sky Runner won't survive that. We need a way in, quiet, smart. She nodded, her expression sharpening. The cuffs. They're tied to Dominion tech. If I can tap into their systems, maybe I can shut down the defenses. Worth a shot, Jack said, pulling up a schematic of the fortress he'd scavenged from old data nets. There's a docking bay on the east side, less guarded. If we can land there, we've got a chance. The ship shuddered as they neared the asteroid field, Dominion patrols already lighting up the scanners. Jack wove through the rocks, his old pilot instincts kicking in, while Lila closed her eyes, focusing. The cuffs flared, and a hum filled the cockpit. Outside, a patrol ship veered off course, its lights flickering as if confused. It's working, Lila said, her voice tight with effort. I'm in their network. The turrets, they're powering down. Jack grinned. That's my girl. He pushed the Sky Runner faster, slipping past the drifting patrol and into the docking bay. The bay was a cavern of red metal, lined with crates and unmanned drones. They landed with a jolt, and Jack grabbed his plasma rifle and toolkit. Ready? Lila stood, energy crackling around her hands. Always. They moved fast, slipping through the bay into the fortress's corridors. The air was thick with the hum of machinery, and crimson-armored guards patrolled in pairs. Jack led the way, sticking to shadows, while Lila used her power to nudge drones offline or bend light around them, hiding their approach. It was a dance of grit and grace, Jack's human cunning paired with Lila's alien strength. They reached a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the center stood a machine, a towering web of wires and glowing orbs, pulsing with the same energy as Lila's cuffs. Around it, dozens of aliens stood in chains, their eyes dull, their bodies marked with glowing restraints. Jack's stomach twisted. "More like you," he whispered. Lila's face hardened. "Varn's army. Bound to his will, just as I was." Before they could move, a voice boomed through the chamber. "You dare enter my domain?" Lord Varn stepped from the shadows, a towering figure in spiked armor, his reptilian skin glinting green. His claws clutched a staff topped with a crimson orb. "The slave returns, and brings a human pest." Jack raised his rifle. "Let them go, Varn. This ends now." Varn laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You think you can stop me? With her power, I'll bind every star, every soul. The galaxy will kneel." Lila stepped forward, her cuffs blazing. "Not while I breathe." She thrust her hands out, and the machine trembled, its orbs flickering. Varn snarled, slamming his staff down. A wave of red energy surged, striking Lila's cuffs. She staggered, the silver light dimming as crimson crept back in. "You're mine," Varn hissed. "Always will be." Jack didn't hesitate. He dove for the machine, dodging a swipe from Varn's claws. His toolkit hit the floor, and he yanked out the disruptor he'd used on Lila's cuffs. "Keep him busy," he shouted. Lila nodded, forcing herself up. She unleashed a storm of energy, hurling Varn back as Jack worked. He jammed the disruptor into the machine's core, rewiring circuits with frantic precision. The war had taught him this, how to break things, how to turn the enemy's tools against them. The machine sparked, its hum rising to a scream. Varn roared, lunging at Lila. She caught him in a field, lifting him off the ground, but her strength faltered, the cuffs pulling at her. "Jack, hurry," she yelled. "Almost there," he shouted, twisting the last wire. The disruptor pulsed, and the machine erupted in light. The orb shattered, and a shockwave rippled through the chamber. The chained aliens gasped, their restraints cracking, their eyes clearing. Lila's cuffs split apart, falling to the floor in pieces, and she glowed, blue and silver, free at last. Varn dropped, his staff rolling away. "No," he bellowed, scrambling for it. But the freed aliens moved, their powers awakening, fire, gravity, light, turning on their captor. Jack grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her back as the chamber erupted in chaos. Varn's screams faded under the fury of those he'd enslaved. "We need to go," Jack said, leading her toward an exit. The fortress shook, alarms blaring as the rebellion spread. They reached the docking bay, the Sky Runner still waiting. Jack fired up the engines while Lila stood at the hatch, her power flaring to hold off a squad of guards. The ship lifted off, bursting free as the asteroid cracked behind them, the stronghold collapsing in flames. The stars stretched out ahead, endless and bright. Jack slumped in the pilot's seat, letting out a long breath. "We did it." Lila settled beside him, her skin still glowing faintly. "You did it, Jack. You gave them, us, a chance." He shook his head. "We're a team. Couldn't have pulled it off without you." She smiled, softer this time. "What now?" Jack gazed at the stars, a spark of curiosity in his green eyes. "The galaxy's big. Plenty of fights left, plenty of people who need help. You in?" Lila laughed, a sound like music against the hum of the ship. "Try to stop me." The Sky Runner soared on, a small speck carrying two souls who defied an empire. Behind them, the freed aliens spread out, their powers lighting up the dark, proof that chains could break, that courage could rewrite fate. Ahead lay new worlds, new battles, and a story that would never truly end.